Hi, thanks for coming out tonight. In 1992, I just finished my studies at college in comparative literature at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And I had just started drawing comics. I just discovered them sort of in my college years. I didn't go to art school. I studied linguistics and comparative literature. So what I did discover was the world of fanzines and mini comics, which was really popular in the kind of pre-internet days especially, although it still exists. The idea of just making your own comic, drawing it, writing it, photocopying it, stapling it, and sharing it with friends and other artists. I was still living in Ann Arbor where I'd gone to school, and I was working in a bookstore, Borders Books, if any of you remember that. It was a chain that doesn't exist anymore. It was the first store in the chain in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And that store had a French literature section, and I spoke French, still do. And a friend of mine who works in the store one day put in my hands a book by a French author named Raymond Queneau. And in the 1940s, Raymond Queneau went with a friend to see a concert of music by Johann Sebastian Bach. The piece of music they saw was actually specifically the art of the Fugue, which is one of Bach's most famous pieces. And a fugue is a very simple, a series of compositions based on a very simple melody. So Art of the Fugue has a very small piece of melody that goes dun 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 da 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 dum. And over the course of 20 or so fugues and variations, Bach restates this theme with four voices, and often in a kind of canon form, building up the textures, but also changing it so that in each version, that simple theme might be repeated but more slowly, dun, 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 syncopated a little bit, or even flipped upside down. So if you imagine just taking that score and rotating it, and you get dun, 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 dun. Same melody but flipped. So after this concert, Queneau and his friend were discussing the music and the structure behind it, and they decided it would be a good idea for Queneau to attempt a similar experiment in literature. So a few years later, in 1947, he published a book called Exercices de style, Exercises in Style, as it was translated by Barbara Wright, a British translator, in the 60s. In this book, Queneau came up with a very short story, almost more like an anecdote, about a man who sees another man on the bus one day in Paris who's being rude to some other customers. So it's sort of like or passengers rather. It's sort of a very simple anecdote. And then later in the same day, he sees the character again. But what Queneau does is he retells this story 99 different ways. You can see where I stole one of my many ideas I stole for this book. So there are 99 versions of this story, from a straightforward retelling of the story, almost like a newspaper report, to a version done in the form of a play, to a version told as a sonnet or a haiku, and to increasingly strange variations such as telling the story where the events happen in reverse order, or where the colors of the rainbow are inserted into the text, so that we talk about a man on a red bus spots a man wearing an orange shirt with a yellow tie, and so on. And altogether, it becomes a kind of compilation of amazing ideas of creativity and different ways to tell a story and to play with language in particular and storytelling. So I immediately, within days of reading this thing, had decided that I needed to make a comics version of this idea. Not necessarily a direct adaptation of the story, but to take this idea of a simple theme with variations. And obviously, comics use language. We have word balloons for dialogue, we have narration boxes, we have sound effects, thought balloons for inner monologue, and so on. And all of these things apply, are subject to the same rules as prose literature or poetry. But of course, comics is also a visual medium, and we use drawing, and that opens up a whole other field of play. Everything from drawing very realistic characters in a photorealistic style to drawing very cartoony, simple characters, and also the register of the drawing, which might be kind of a heroic superhero style, or it might be a very exaggerated manga style, or it might be a cubist Picasso style, right? We have the whole range of visual expression. It could even be an abstract comic using geometric shapes. The third aspect of comics that's easy to miss is the design component, right? Because comics are, as we'll see, are words and text, but they're arrayed on the page in a very specific way, usually in panels, the boxes that they're in such a way that you're going to read the story, and the order of the panels, the size of the panels, how they relate to the other on a page or in a spread of 2 pages, helps determine the meaning of the comic. I didn't feel ready to take the project on right then. Like I said, I was doing my very first attempts at drawing my own comics. But I sort of set it aside and decided I would come back to it as soon as I could. So the next 5 years, I started doing some illustration work for magazines. I did my first book, a short graphic novel called Black Candy that came and went. I did more mini comics. In 1998, I moved with my girlfriend and now wife, Jessica Abel, who's also a cartoonist, to Mexico. We decided we would go live abroad somewhere and work on our comics and try and learn Spanish and meet people and stuff. It was a great experience. And also seemed like a good time to embark on a new project. So that seemed, I didn't really feel ready, but I think at a certain point you have to just pull the trigger and start working on a project, especially a creative project, because no one's waiting for you to finish it otherwise. You have to sort of do it on your own. So I started working on it and started posting some of the pages online. It was sort of pre-social media, but I had a friend who had a comics website, and so he would post my pages as I finished them, and I started getting feedback from friends and colleagues from the comics world, encouraging me to keep going. So that was really great. Over the course of the next 7 years, I gradually got all 99 drawn. In the meantime, moved back to the US and settled in Brooklyn, got married, and started a whole new life. But eventually, I got this book done and got a book deal with Penguin Books in New York. And this is the edition that we see here on the table here, 99 Ways to Tell a Story, Exercise and Style, which was published in 2005. In the meantime, I'd been showing it to a lot of people in the comics world, including people overseas, and I'll come back to that connection. But within the first couple of years of my book coming out in the US, there was a Spanish edition. I'm going counterclockwise here for some reason. There was a Japanese edition, which was really cool to have, a French edition, which obviously is very important because that's Raymond Queneau and all that connection, which again, I will come back to. The British edition, which is the same as the US edition, but with a nicer cover. This is a Flemish edition done for a Belgian comics festival. And most recently, of course, and the reason I'm here tonight, Boomkniga, my friend Dmitry Yakovlev, decided to publish it here in Russia. I have a Chinese edition coming out later this year, and a South Korean edition came out. These sort of came out of nowhere. Just the last few years, I have a bunch of new editions coming out. So it's been very rewarding to have this kind of strange creative project that I took on continue to have legs and find new readers. So let's take a minute to look at the template comic, is what I call it, the comic that sort of is the basis of the book. That's my little fugue melody that I'm going to do variations on. I decided that I didn't want to just retell Queneau's version because I didn't want to do a remake or a redo of what he did. Also, his story is set very specifically in Paris in the late 40s, and I didn't want to get into it being a sort of historical reenactment kind of thing. And maybe most importantly, as I mentioned, his story is actually in 2 parts. There's a scene on a bus, and there's a scene later that same day at a train station. And his exercise is, if you look at his book, which I encourage you to do, Some of them are like 2 or 3 lines long. Some of them are 4 or 5 pages. And because of comics being a visual medium and having this design aspect I was talking about, I wanted to have my own story that would be a single page that I could repeat over and over again, so that the final book would have a nice kind of layout where you could kind of flip through it, almost like a spot the difference sort of kids book, you know. So it's actually very challenging to come up with a story where nothing happens. This is something that took me a little while to figure out and really take off in the project. Because I didn't want anything to get distracted by a certain conflict or a type of story that was being told. I wanted something very simple, and may not reflect very well on my own personal life, but I ended up choosing a sort of fictional autobiographical anecdote. Let's walk through what happens on this template page. We see, is there a way we can get the keynote thing on the screen to be it's a little bit squashed vertically there. Did anyone hear me? No one's here from the image. All right, well, hopefully someone will fix the image in a little while. Imagine this being squashed by about 20% that way. So we see a man sitting at a computer working. He stands up and puts the computer to sleep. He walks into the next room. At that point, a voice from upstairs asks him what time it is. He answers. The voice upstairs thanks him, and he closes the refrigerator door. Then he pauses an instant and realizes he's forgotten what he was looking for. You can see why it's a bit self-deprecating that I say it's about me. But it's not a true story, but it is the kind of story that happens to me and to probably most of you, pretty regularly. It barely qualifies as an anecdote, right? But what it does provide is the basic elements of storytelling, for comics especially. We have some characters, we have some props and a location, we have some dialogue, we have an interior monologue even, we have an exchange between some characters, some action, and we have 8 panels containing this story. And so that's going to be our raw material for making new stories. So what are some of the ways you can tell a story in comics? Well, a lot of people, when they think of comics, especially if they haven't read a lot, they tend to imagine superheroes fighting and funny animals doing silly stuff or making snarky comments about their masters. But there's no reason a comic can't be used to tell the most ordinary kind of storytelling. One of the most fundamental ways we experience stories is somebody sitting across from us and telling us about something that happened, right? And this is something that we can do in comics. Here's a place where the layout, the panels can really help to divide up the kind of rhythm of the speaking. You can almost think of it like a musical score. Little things like the small changes of gestures of the character can add nuance. The size of the panels can add like a kind of beat, like a metronome kind of effect. In the US, for example, there are some cartoonists who've done really great work with dialogue, or rather, single person monologue comics like this. Most notably Harvey Pekar. There was a movie made sort of based on his comics work called American Splendor that came out a few years ago, and he worked with Robert Crumb and a lot of other great artists. And Louis Trondheim is an artist in France who's been published also in the US, who's also done a lot of great work that's just a person talking to you. It brings out a kind of theatrical side of comics. Another basic aspect of storytelling we can think about, whether it's comics or other media, is the point of view, right? If we go back for a second to the, excuse me, can we fix the keynote on the computer? It's a little squashed vertically. It's kind of stretched out.
Okay.
And usually there's that little keynote button, or what is that what it's called? Or key keystroke, I forget the name of it. Getting there. A little bit more. Yeah, a bit more. A bit more. All right, that's good. That'll work. Okay. Thanks. We are experiencing technical difficulties. Please stand by, and I will take the moment to have a sip of water. I've got too many things in my hand now, excuse me. Now, if we go back to our template comic, we can see that it's got a very neutral kind of point of view. You don't really notice who's watching this action. I mean, we're watching the action, we're the readers. And to create that effect, that sort of neutral effect, you can think of it as almost like a camera on a tripod sitting in the room filming the action. Or like a person sitting across the room. Or if this is a novel, this is like the visual equivalent, I think, to like an omniscient narrator. You know, it's just someone who's observing everything happening. But you can, of course, change the point of view that a story is told from. And here we have a subjective point of view. So it's the same story told through the eyes of the main character, right? Now notice it's the same 8 panels, the same bit of dialogue, the same thought balloons, the same actions. All we've changed is that instead of seeing from a camera across the room, we're now in the eyes of the character. I drew this page 20 years ago now, and it felt a little bit like daring and experimental because there's not a lot of, or there wasn't a lot of art out there, visual storytelling through a first-person point of view. And in fact, Orson Welles in the 40s tried to make a film out of Heart of Darkness, told through the point of view of Marlowe, the military attaché. And he gave up because he found he didn't think it was plausible enough. But in the last 20 years, video games and first-person shooters and just the general interface of walking around with your iPhone, filming stuff, has made this kind of subjective point of view a very common, everyday kind of point of view. In the book, there's a point of view, there are a couple other point of view pages, one from the point of view of the character upstairs who asks what time it is. There's one from the point of view of a voyeur spying from across the street. But as I was almost finished with the book in 2004 and finished in the last few pages, it occurred to me that there was a third character that I was neglecting in this story, which is really at the end a bit of a bizarre love triangle between the man downstairs, the voice upstairs, and the refrigerator. So I did this comic in the point of view of the refrigerator. Now to get back to Raymond Queneau for a minute, one of the things I love about his book and his work in general is that he'll choose a rule, like the idea of telling a story 99 times, or from a certain point of view, and he'll follow it to its logical conclusion, even if that final page might be a little bit absurd. So when I realized I was going to do a page from the point of view of the refrigerator, I also realized that, of course, the first 5 panels, the refrigerator is closed. So if I was going to be faithful to the rule, I would have to draw 5 pages of near total darkness. Not only that, but the first few bits of dialogue before the door's been open would be all muffled. So I drew them barely legible and with little sort of dotted lines around them. I've talked a little bit about the graphic design element of comics and how the layout of the panels is very important. So here's a bit of an example of what I mean by that. Again, using the same page, the same story, the same dialogue, and 8 panels, I made one change to the way the story is presented, and that is that the 8 panels are presented horizontally in thin strips, which is a bit of a strange way to present the story. For example, in the 3rd panel, I really had to kind of stretch the perspective to fit the man and the refrigerator both into the panel. And in the 5th panel, we end up with just a very close-up shot of a hairy forearm, which is not necessarily the most pleasant thing. But there's another reason I chose this particular way of presenting the panels. And the last panel of the page offers a clue. It might remind you of something you've seen before. This is Clint Eastwood from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Any number of other famous kind of spaghetti westerns and other films from the 60s that really emphasized the cinemascope or widescreen film effect. Something we use less today, but you still see it, like Quentin Tarantino's done like widescreen versions of his films and stuff. In the comics community, authors, fans, and critics, there's kind of an ongoing debate about the language of comics and how pure it should be, how much it should really have its own codes, its own rules, and not defer to other media, especially dominant media like Hollywood films and stuff. So the most extreme position on that is that cartoonists shouldn't use film language at all. We should avoid using things like imitations of camera movements or zooms, or using talking about over-the-shoulder shot and all this kind of screenplay language we get from film and television. And there's something to be said about looking for what is native to the two-dimensional drawn nature of comics. But at the same time, I also think that there's more richness to be found in a dialogue between different media and different cultures. So to my mind, I say go ahead and borrow from film. And I mean, again, this is a book that took its idea from a work of literature, which took its idea from a piece of music. So I'm already deep into that side of the of the argument. Obviously, to look at this page, no one's going to mistake this for cinema, right? You can see that little, if you know film language, you might see the wink to Sergio Leone in the bottom. But it's very clearly a comics page because comics has the multiple panels, which creates a kind of space-time effect, simultaneity, whereas film, of course, is continuous. And to drive home that point, I made this page. Same basic idea, same story and everything, but instead of 8 horizontal panels, I came up with 8 vertical panels, which is something obviously you can't do in film, probably wouldn't want to do in film, but it was kind of a funny way to sort of tweak that argument a little bit further. And for me personally, in my comics that aren't this project, I don't really use skinny panels like this. I find them a little bit awkward. There's a lot of unused dead space, and like in the 6th panel, all I could do was have a giant slide of a refrigerator door filling up the whole panel. That doesn't seem very efficient to me. However, if you look at a lot of American superhero comics especially, and kind of independent pop comics from Image Comics, you'll find this kind of layout a lot. It's actually, certain kinds of artists really favor it as a storytelling strategy. So it really comes down to artistic use and preference. This page shows another aspect of the book, which is where I play around with the fact that comics are drawings on paper, and they're actually like a plastic medium. So I don't know how you can see in this slide, but if you look closely, you can see that inside each panel, you'll see a little version of each panel from the template. So in the first panel, you can see the guy sitting at the desk. And what I did was I printed that out, pasted it on a larger piece of paper, and drew what should be outside that panel. Now we talk about the picture plane and the idea that a comics panel or a TV image or a painting in a frame, that frame, you can, especially for a realistic representational work of art, is kind of like a window, and you're looking into a space where something's happening. So by that logic, if you pulled back from that window, you would see what's actually in the rest of the room. But it's not a window, it's a drawing, right? I can do what I want. It's like a Bob Ross kind of thing. It's my own little world. So, so in this page, what I did was, instead of drawing what's outside the window, draw the least probable thing you might expect. So instead of sitting in his office, he's on a speedboat cruising across a lake. Or in the second panel, everything's floating up in the air. Or in the 6th panel, the refrigerator door becomes the heart cavity of a lovelorn robot. There are quite a few pages that are a little bit unclassifiable, except that I had a funny idea usually some kind of rule or principle that I decided to follow to its logical extreme. Again, taking the example of Raymond Queneau and seeing where it would take me. So in this page, for example, the protagonist increases by 1 in every panel. So you have 1 Matt in the first panel, then 2, then 3, and so on, until you have 8 Matts surrounding the refrigerator in the last panel. And none of them can remember what they're looking for. There are also a lot of pages in the book where I make reference to the history of comics in a mixture of homage and parody. So Tales from the Crypt, you might recognize. It's a famous horror comic from the 50s, among other titles that were popular at the time until there was a big sort of hullabaloo and they ended up being censored. But it's also known for a movie version that was made in the 80s, and there was a TV series for a while as well. So these are very kind of gaudy horror comics for kids, and they have a lot of hallmarks of comics of that time in the US. Very gaudy, bright colors, a kind of almost very heavily illustrated style, a kind of more of a commercial magazine illustration style. A lot of text, too much text. They put a lot of words in there. Partly to justify to distributors and parents that they were producing wholesome material that children would learn about reading from, and not just horror comics with fun, weird monsters in it. And you have this character of the crypt keeper or the vault keeper or whatever that introduces each story. So when I wanted to do a homage to that tradition, I had to really rethink my whole visual style, because up to now we've been seeing stuff in black and white, drawn in my sort of semi-neutral style. It's a little bit realistic, not particularly cartoony, not particularly realistic. So for this version, which is called Exorcise in Style, I had to come up with a whole new way of drawing it by studying these other artists and copying the way they drew stuff. And obviously, the other thing I had to do was add color to have that same, because the color is a very important color storytelling tool in general. And in this case, it sort of signifies that mid-century pop comics aesthetic. So just to be clear, this is not like a collage thing. I would actually redraw, basically kind of try to imitate and mimic the style of these different artists. If we go back a couple of panels here, slides, if you look at this, the man holding the stake in the middle of that page there, where we're looking over his shoulder, that's a drawing by Jack Davis, who's one of the great artists of Tales from the Crypt and also Mad Magazine, and you've probably seen a lot of drawings by him. So I kind of studied that drawing and tried to copy the way he drew the face and the shading on it for my second panel there with the Matt character looking over his shoulder. You might notice that I turned the laptop computer into a Ouija board. It's a horror comic. This is the Bayeux Tapestry. It's actually an embroidery, but we call it the Bayeux Tapestry. It's from Bayeux, France, and it's a work that was done in the 11th century to commemorate the Battle of Hastings, which had to do with fighting between the French and the British at the time. And in books of comics history and in articles about comics and where they come from and so on, it's often evoked as a kind of proto-comic or even just flat out as a comic strip, because it does have images that are narrative, that clearly have the same characters and tell the story, and you have text in Latin on top as well. And there's something to do that, because these are visual representative drawings. They're even in a kind of a cartoony style. But to me, they don't really qualify as modern comics, because you can't really make sense of them if you don't know the story of the battle already. They're more like a secret. They're more like illustrations meant to go along. Even the text, you have if you know the whole story, it serves as like a reminder of this famous event. But that didn't stop me from doing my own version for my exercise in style. And so I tweaked the format to be a little bit more directly narrative. I have a little buzzer, but it's not really bright enough to work in here. Which has a brave knight setting off on a trip, and then his wife asks him the time. He has to consult a sundial in the second strip there. And then he arrives at this icebox. I had a friend who knows Latin translate text for me. And of course, there's no refrigerators in ancient Latin, so he called it the glacier, ad glacier system, which is like to the icebox or something like that. And he can't find what he's looking for. Manga, of course, you can recognize it, is a huge force in world comics and even, I would say, pop culture at this point. When I first started working on this book in 1998, they were really just starting to become kind of known in the US and the West in general. In fact, I mentioned that we were living in Mexico City when I started working on this, and I was seeing more manga in the supermarket magazine stand in Mexico than I was seeing back in the US. They would have like Ranma 1/2 and Dragon Ball Z and stuff at the supermarket, and I was like, oh, this is cool. I haven't seen this back in the States. It was more of a cult thing at that point, but of course in the intervening 20 years it's become a massive force. And I think it's great because it's really interesting, totally different culture of comic storytelling. And very valuable too, among other reasons, because it's brought women into comics in a way that we didn't really have before. A lot of young girls started reading manga, and then that made them want to draw comics, and they get older and they come with their own voices, and that's been really changed the kind of demographic of comics readers and authors today. And some manga fans are so fixated on its particular codes that they want to separate, again, like with the film and comics thing, they want to divide it off from Western comics and say, no, it's not comics, it's manga, it's a different thing. Like manga, yes, culturally there's definitely a different trajectory, but at a formal level, these are still words and images put into panels in a sequence to tell stories. And I think they very much share that same language and can teach each other new things. There's lots of stuff to be learned from manga. So I embarked on a manga version of the exercise in style. If you're disoriented, keep in mind you've got to read it from right to left, right? Because when manga now, even in the US, when they're printed in English, tend to be printed from back to front in the Japanese style to preserve the original page order. Once again, totally different graphic style. This is not, like with the Tales from the Crypt one, I'm not referencing one artist in particular. I was looking at a lot of different sources and just trying to figure out how to draw manga. But you can see some of the hallmarks of the style, more cartoony faces with the sort of classic big eyes that are very kind of hard for people to get used to at first. Things like the fact that the characters tend to be pretty cartoony and simplified, but the backgrounds are often very highly rendered and even photorealistic. There's this gray tone going on, which I did using the computer, but they often use these old-fashioned kind of transfer sticker dots that you put on the page. And you'll notice too that there's lots of sound effects. That's a really important part of manga that I really love, is these very visual sound effects that they use. So I had some Japanese friends who I met in Mexico, by the way, translate the dialogue, but also give me a bunch of these sound effects that I could put in graphically to show the refrigerator humming and the keyboard clacking and stuff like that. And the page layout is also different. In manga page layout, there's a lot more dynamism. You see a lot more diagonals. They use bleeds a lot, where the image goes right off the page, and so on. And these are things you now see more and more in American comics. It's really been a big influence, one of the many influences they've had. This is a reference to some of the earliest American newspaper comics. Winsor McCay, who some of you might know from his color work, Little Nemo and Slumberland, which is a really fantastical kind of Lewis Carroll doing a comic strip kind of thing. He also had a series called Dream of a Rarebit Fiend that I really liked, that were sort of more like bourgeois anxiety dreams of the early 20th century. And they often had to do with transformations and things getting out of control. So in this one, the guy is looking through his refrigerator and he's pulling out all this stuff, including his wife, who asks him what time it is, and increasingly larger stuff until there's an elephant barreling out at the end. And then he wakes up, it's a dream, and he ate too much So Welsh rarebit is like a melted cheese sauce you put on toast, and it's like pub food. It's very good, actually. And I can see why it had a reputation for giving people bad dreams, but that's where that comes from. I also asked myself, what were the limits of what you would normally consider a comic in this book? So there are a number of pages in the book that are not things you would think of as normally being comics. But the question is, in what sense is a map a comic, right? Well, in some ways it is, because it's something you need to, a story you need to tell yourself using words and images and moving it across a page. So you might start in the city of Desk and move down the 115 highway towards the city of Refrigerator, being careful not to travel too far. You might end up lost in the desert. So like I said, it took me 7 years, not of nonstop work, but of working on this off and on to get the book done. And during that time, I referred to Queneau's book a lot, and I started to learn more about his work and the other things that he did. And I learned pretty quickly that Exercise in Style was a sort of predecessor to a project he began years later in 1960 called Oulipo, which in French is Ouvroir de littérature potentielle, which is usually translated into English as the Workshop for Potential Literature. And this was a kind of a literary salon that he formed with some friends of writers, but also engineers, scientists, mathematicians, who shared an interest in experimental literature and sort of looking for new forms of telling stories and writing poems. And they would meet every week to have dinner, drink a lot of wine, and propose new ideas for taking ideas from the sciences or old forgotten literary forms to create new literature. And in fact, Oulipo still exists, and they still do these monthly meetings where they share ideas. Let me go back one more sec. So a lot of these ideas take the form of what they call constraints, of which we've seen already a bunch in my book. A constraint is just a rule, sort of a game-like rule that you impose on yourself, a challenge to tell the same story 99 times, for example, or to tell a story using all the colors of the rainbow. These are all constraints that are arbitrary. They're not really useful, you know. They're just kind of more like a sort of game-like challenge to oneself to see if you can pull it off. So Queneau would describe the members of the group often as rats who propose to build the maze from which they plan to escape. So they're sort of coming their own guinea pigs in these experimental games. And you know, it sounds a little dry, and when you talk about science and engineers proposing rules for literature, it sounds a bit disastrous. But the focus is on play and finding new forms that are fun and amusing. Raymond Queneau was actually originally a surrealist. He was a member of the surrealist movement, and he got disillusioned with how authoritarian the group was, and part of his, and also how flabby a lot of like automatic writing. If you ever tried that in school, doing automatic writing where you just, you might have a few cool ideas, but mostly it's pretty illegible. So he was trying to find more structured ways to reach a similar kind of ecstatic, weird, crazy type of literature. So here's an example of an Oulipian constraint. It's called a snowball, and it's very straightforward, as you can see. I am the text which begins sparely, assuming magnitude constantly, perceptibly proportional, incorporating unquestionable incrementations. Right? So every line of the poem needs to be one letter longer. You can have a melting snowball, which goes in the other direction. You can have an avalanche, where you have multiple paragraphs, multiple stanzas like that, and so on. And so you'll notice that the poem describes its own constraint. So that's another feature of a lot of Oulipo work, is creating a constraint and then writing a work where you're sort of talking about what you're doing. Sort of a very self-aware practice. I also came across a work that was the direct inspiration for the founding of Oulipo that Raymond Queneau did in 1959. It's a book called, in French, it's 100 000 milliards de sonnets, And it's usually translated, there are different ways you can translate this number because it's so big, but 100 million poems. So as with exercise style, where Queneau is inspired by Bach, in this case, he was thinking about these sort of chimera children's books we've all seen, where you can change the head, the torso, and the legs of different kinds of animals or people and come up with all kinds of imaginary creatures. And it occurred to him that you could use this principle of little movable flaps of paper as a way to create a poem that could be read in multiple ways. One thing I admire about Queneau and Oulipo is that they were very innovative and forward-looking, but they also had great respect for tradition and always liked to look back to earlier forms and writers and what they were doing. So possibly to signal that connection, Queneau decided to write a sonnet that would be, that you could read 100 million times. And the way he did it was to write 10 sonnets, right? And a sonnet has 14 lines. And then he had it printed so that all of the lines in the poem were cut. It was printed on cardstock. So the book is actually only 10 pages. But as you flip through all these lines and recombine them, and I have a copy of it, and I admit it is a bit ungainly as it looks, but there are also web readers you can find of this poem that are quite cool. It gives you a huge combination of poems. Now, it might sound arbitrary too, but Queneau made sure that these 10 sonnets all observed a similar rhyme scheme, so that they always rhyme in an A-B, sort of classic couplet and stanza kind of form. They also thematically go around a certain number of topics, so that you're never too, it's never too random, the stuff they're talking about. It's really quite remarkable. I've yet to find one that doesn't make any sense at all. I've read a bunch of them, but not all of them, because in the course of working on the book is when Queneau and to his friend François Le Lyonnais, who was an engineer and really overall smart guy, and they tried to figure out what is the exact number of sonnets created by this form. And Le Lyonnais figured out that it was an exponential number. It was 10 to the 14th power. In other words, a 1 with 14 zeros after it. And just doing some rough calculations, sort of making a guesstimate of how long it takes people to read poems, they decided that it was impossible to read this book in one lifetime. In fact, it would take about 20 lifetimes to read all the possible poems generated by this little book. And this brings us back to another important word in the name of the group, Oulipo. Right? It's the workshop for potential literature. And I really like that idea of potential, because it points outward to possibility and to all the things that remain to be done and remain to be discovered. Right? It's saying and it also connects it a little bit to conceptual art, because we're talking about a work of art that you can't fully take in. It's something you can think about as much as actually read. Another very important writer for Oulipo, and perhaps the most famous one, who's written the most famous Oulipo work, is Georges Perec, French writer born in Poland and brought by his parents to France during World War II. They both died, probably his mother in a concentration camp and his father fighting with the French in the army. And he wrote a lot of really incredible books and writing, and fortunately he's really become having a sort of renaissance. He died pretty young in the early 80s of cancer. But in the last 10 years, I've seen more and more people translating his work into English. He's become a big kind of buzzword in contemporary art. There are a lot of art exhibits inspired by his ideas and his works, which are numerous. But the book I want to talk about right now is called La Disparition. There is not really a translation, but an adaptation of it into English called A Void. And this book is about 350 pages. It's a kind of fun, fast-moving mystery novel, almost like an Agatha Christie kind of murder mystery where all these people keep dying off. And there's one thing that's strange about it. It doesn't have the letter E anywhere in the novel. That sounds kind of impossible to do because, of course, in French especially, E is the most common vowel, and it's also associated with many feminine word endings. And yet, one of the main characters in the book is a woman. So the exercise of the book consists in how can you tell a story when you're not using the most common letter of the alphabet. You can imagine in English, it's not much easier. But not only does he tell the story, but very famously, when the book came out in 1969, a major literary newspaper in France wrote a review of the book, and the reviewer didn't notice that the E was missing. That's how oddly compelling the writing is once you start reading it. There's a lot more to say about this book, but I'm going to move on. And I'm also going to pass over Life User's Manual, which is another very important and amazing book of his that used a lot of these Oulipian constraints in its construction. For fun, I want to show you one project by a younger Oulipo member named Clementine Minhwa, who's more of a visual artist and kind of a prankster. And she has a great book called Sans Titre, which is a play on 100 titles, but also untitled, without a title. And in this book, she takes popular French paperback editions of classic literature. For example, here's Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment, which in French is Crime et Châtiment. And she basically comes up with really silly references, word plays, and puns to try and tweak these things and make fun of them. So crime et châtiment, if you think about it, sounds a little bit like another French expression, crème et châtiment, cream and the lying cat. So it's just a word play and it's very silly, but notice that it does have this idea of crime and punishment included even in the cat version. 1992. I mentioned that year already. That's the year that I first read Exercise in Style, and when I was just starting to work on my own comics. Unbeknownst to me, at that same time in Paris, a bunch of peers of mine were having a meeting to deciding to create a French comics version of the Oulipo group that they called OUBAPO, ba from the French word for comics, which is bande dessinée. So it's the workshop for potential comics. And they approached Oulipo and asked their permission and got an official blessing. In fact, there's a whole kind of subculture of what they call OU-Expo, where like the X stands for different kinds of disciplines. So there's an OU-Po, which is the workshop for potential crime fiction. There's a workshop for potential painting. There's a workshop for potential cooking, and all sorts of stuff. So the workshop potential comics is entering into that larger tradition. And they started playing around too with different constraints and figuring out how they would work for comics in much the same way that I was thinking about how I could use the ideas of Queneau's Exercise in Style for a comic book project. So they might take an entire Tintin book, like the Cigars of the Pharaoh, and reduce it to only the panels that have exclamation points or question marks over the character's head. Which on the one hand is just a silly way to do a kind of détournement or like a remix of a Tintin book, of a beloved work of popular culture. And yet it also works as a strange kind of literary criticism, because of course Tintin is the unflappable boy journalist who always is on top of every situation. And yet in this one page, we see this kind of other side of Tintin where he is constantly confused and surprised by what's going on. And this was an explicit goal of Oulipo as well, to be a way of using experimental forms as a way to analyze literature in a kind of playful way. And again, it prefigures remix culture and mashups and all this kind of stuff. Tintin in America, in the hands of the OUBAPO member Jochen Gerner, becomes TNT in America by applying ink directly to the page, to the cover of the book, and later to the entire book, blacking out most of the book, leaving only color fields to make these sort of abstract shapes, and sort of highlighting keywords that all have to do with Al Capone and dynamite and machine guns. This is like sort of the Chicago gangster era Tintin book. When I started working on my Exercise in Style, a friend of mine who worked in a very good comic book store in Cambridge called Million Year Picnic pointed me to the first OUBAPO collection. He's like, hey, you got to check this out, because he knew about my Exercise in Style. So needless to say, my jaw dropped to find there were these French guys who were doing the same kind of stuff with comics. So I immediately got in touch with them, and I sent them some photocopies of the pages I'd worked, and they said, oh, this is great, let's keep in touch. And when my book came out, the French edition actually has the Oubapo logo on the cover, which was very exciting for me. At some point in the mid-2000s, they made me their US correspondent, although they never bothered to tell me until about 4 years later. When I met them at a comics convention in France, some of the members, and they're like, oh yeah, we made you part of the group, you didn't know? I guess my certificate got lost in the mail or something. But they're all amazing artists and great guys, and one woman. So to jump ahead a few years, in 2012, I got the chance to live in France for what ended up being 4 years on a residency at a place called the Maison des Auteurs, which is a comic artist residency in the city of Angoulême in the southwest of France, where every year they have a really big comics festival. It's one of the most important in the world. And they have a kind of comics culture center with a museum, a library, and this residency program. So during those 4 years, I was able to do some projects with my friends in Oubapo and hang out socially. And one of the projects, my first project officially collaborating with Oubapo was itself a kind of exercise in style. One of the things I find is that these projects I've done years ago keep on coming back in new forms and in finding new ways to be interesting. So in this case, it's a collaborative work with 4 other members of the group based on who got their pages finished on time for the publishing date. Louis Trondheim, who's a member of the group and is a very well-known French cartoonist and very popular one, but who also has a more experimental side. He proposed that we take all of the images from one issue of a newspaper. In this case, it was the Valentine's Day issue of Libération, the left-leaning French daily, and cut out all of the pictures, including the illustrations, but not including advertisements. So we ended up with 44 images. And then we all needed to make a comic using those 44 images. We could redraw them, but they had to be in the same sequence. So, for example, this is the cover of the magazine, of the newspaper, which very inconveniently had a giant drawing all around it. So, but it was kind of useful because it gave me, for example, in my case, this is the cover, the first page of my contribution, The Heart of the King. Here's another example of one of the photos. This is some politician from Greece, so I don't remember. Manolis Glezos, I guess. This is how he becomes transformed in one of the pages by Etienne Lecroix, one of the contributors to the book. Here's how he appears in my story. And here on the upper right is how he appears turned into a kind of abstract chunk of granite by Jochen Gerner, who did the TNT in America book. So I kept on reading about Oulipo and reading more Oulipian work and then Oubapo work, and became really interested in this idea of constraints. So what exactly do I mean by constraint? We've already seen a bunch of examples. Well, constraints are all around us in everything we do. They're the form that we put all content into. So, for example, any writer, artist, whether they're a student or a seasoned pro, will tell you that they hate being, we still have this anxiety about looking at a blank page. And there's nothing more stressful than someone just giving you a blank sheet of paper and saying, here, draw something brilliant. Have fun with it, do whatever you want, you know? Because total freedom is actually paradoxically shuts you down very often. When I teach drawing classes and I have my students do some drawings just on some loose leaf paper, I find that they're very unfocused and kind of all over the place and bleeding off to one side or whatever. So I took to asking my students to just draw a little box, an outline box like a comics panel or a frame on the page, kind of like that. And very suddenly, the drawings would start to have definition to them. They would fit, they would think about the composition and how things fit together. And it's that constraint of having a box around your drawing forces you to focus in and make decisions about how things work in relation to their box. into the other parts of this space that you've delimited. Now, it's a bit strange because all I'm doing with that box is I'm just drawing that sheet of paper a little smaller, right? But there's like a psychological thing where the sheet of paper feels like an endless expanse of freedom, whereas drawing a panel border about something gives you that feeling of like, all right, here's a defined border that I'm going to work with, and it's a parameter that defines what I'm going to do. This is why the grid is such a fundamental tool for everything from fine art to architecture to graphic design. And as you might notice, comics as well, because that's the basic panel layout starts with a grid. And even comics that have really crazy page layouts, usually underneath there's a sort of grid structure that holds it all together. So you can make a whole comic that is just about the fact that it is 9 panels long. The golden rectangle, there are lots of different principles using different kinds of grids and measured sort of mathematical restraints to help us build things, design things, think about composition. And these kinds of constraints become, we don't really think about them. If you're drawing comics, even if you think about writing, on your word processor, you've got margins already in place, right? These are things that just help you focus your ideas. You don't really think about them, and they're not going to help you come up with an idea necessarily. So the kind of constraints I've been learning about through Oulipo and Oubapo and playing around with comics myself are something more akin to playing a game, right? A grid is a very functional restraint. We need that constraint to help us organize space, to frame a picture, for example. But writing a novel without using the letter E serves no practical function at all. In fact, it's highly impractical. The only reason you do that is with a sense of play, with a sense of exploration. And this is something that I strive for in my creative practice, whether I'm drawing or writing, playing guitar, whatever I'm doing, is to find that moment of getting lost in the playfulness of what I'm doing. Both losing the hang up of whether it's good or not, or whether it's serious or whether it's playful, just getting lost in that deep kind of concentration that children have when they're playing with a couple of Legos or sitting in a park stacking rocks in order on top of each other, right? Diane Ackerman is an American writer and poet. She wrote a book called Deep Play where she describes this phenomenon that you can observe in children, in artists, and really in anyone in different types of activities. But it's the idea of an almost meditative kind of trance you get into when you just get really so into something that time disappears and you're in the moment and really living it fully. But another book I'll point you to is Homo Ludens, which is a historical study by a Dutch medieval historian, Johan Huizinga, that really traces how this idea of play and ritual and non-functional kind of useless activities undergird the entire history of civilization. It's a very fundamental act. So this playing with constraints, it seems a little bit abstruse and like being avant-garde for the fun of it, but to me it really gets at the heart of a very human activity. Once I finished working on the exercise and style, I was eager to keep going and to dive deeper into this idea of constraint. So I decided to come up with my own constraint. There are plenty out there, and one thing I should say about Oulipo and Oubapo for that matter is that they consider themselves in some sense archivists of constraints, games, structures, and rules. And everything that they do is done with the idea of sharing with the rest of the world. You don't have to ask permission from the Oulipo to write a lipogram, which is what you call a text when you remove one letter. Once it's out there, it's considered fair game for anyone else to play around with. But because I was into this idea of, again, finding that deep focus of really getting into something, I thought it would be fun to come up with my own constraints. And eventually I came up with a very simple idea that I called the Alphabet City, which was the idea of taking, making a comic based on the alphabet. So in the English alphabet, that would give you a 26 panel long comic. You know, of course, it would depend on what alphabet you're using. And you could arrange those panels however you want. As you might have seen, I like a 9-panel grid. That's sort of a kind of shape that I like to use a lot for my comics. So, and I realized if I did a 9-panel grid, I could basically get a 3-page comic using these 26 panels. 27, but then that was the title. So the way this worked was, again, this was where that deep play becomes very important, because from the idea to the execution, there's a huge gap, right? I didn't start this story with, I had no character, no story in mind. All I knew was I was going to make a comic where each panel, and I don't think I explained this one part of the rule, which is that each panel of those 26 panels needs to correspond to its letter of the alphabet. So the first panel is an A, the second panel is B, and so on. So here's, you know, panel A, I started working on it. At first, all I did was work thinking about the shapes that this letter takes, right? And uppercase A, lowercase a, different kind of fonts, serif fonts, the A with a little weird hook on the top, or the A that's just round with the bar on the side, and just doodled. And I had pages of these drawings where I would just kind of try and draw faces and figure out the different ways that I could use this particular letter form to make a drawing. Here's what ended up being the first panel of that comic. And if you look at the character's hands crossing, they form an A just with her thumbs and her hands. Also the line of the table and her forearms make another A. There's sort of nested A's hidden there. And even the little pencil lying on the desk on top of the two, you know, randomly dropped pieces of paper form yet another A. I can't remember for sure or not, but it's possible that that little detail of drawing the papers at an angle like a professor's messy table might have been one of the places I started thinking about a character, that I was going to do a story about a professor and a language professor. And I decided I would write about a language professor because I'm writing about the alphabet, right? Everything I'm doing here is coming out of the letter forms of A, B, C, D, and so on. So it seemed appropriate to me that whatever story I ended up telling should have to do with the Roman alphabet. So slowly as I doodled, characters and situations started to arise. When I was drawing the F panel, for example, I ended up with this kind of obsequious position of a character who it turns out is bringing very bad news of a betrayal of our main character, Dr. Zek, from her home country, which is a sort of imaginary Eastern European country, which I steal a lot of stuff in my work. So this was taken from Nabokov's Zembla, which is the imaginary country in his novel Pale Fire. And so this guy is like an envoy from Zembla who comes to visit our protagonist, who's living in the US as a professor. And at this moment, I realized he's handing her this letter that's going to basically ruin her life. And the way I drew it made me realize, oh, he's a bad guy. The way he's doing that is too obsequious. He's being very insincere in the way he's being overly formal as he bends over. So the drawing itself was telling me not only what the story was, but even about the personalities of the characters. By the same token, when we first see the real kind of bad guy of the story, who's back in Zembla and is, you know, the sort of former lover and mentor of Professor Zek, I wanted to show him as a kind of decrepit older guy who's all saggy. And it just so happened that I had the letter J when I got to that point in the story as these things developed. And so, of course, J, I get the name Judas as well, because there's also a text constraint where I tried to have the drawings be modeled on the letter J, but also to have the text in each panel begin with that same letter. So we get Judas, And you can see the old man's face, the J's give him like bags under his eyes, a long droopy nose, big double chin, all this stuff created with the letter J. Right up until the sort of a very erasing negative act at the end of the story. And so this is just what it looked like. I don't have time to read the whole story for you. I'm going to wind up here. So, as I said, these ideas keep coming around in my work and in my life, and bringing me new ideas and new directions to pursue. So when I moved to France, one of the things I wanted to do, besides get a lot of comics done and collaborate with Dubapo, was to work more deeply with drawing just as an activity. As I said, my background is actually in literature, and I don't really have a formal art training, which is very common among cartoonists, especially in the US. A lot of us start just because we like drawing and we doodle, and that turns into making little comics, which we trade with friends, and we get some encouragement, and then it's too late. We're stuck. We can't turn back. So I wanted to do a drawing project and even something kind of abstract. And I was kicking around for ideas, and it happened that I was reading another book that gave me a good idea to steal from, which is a book by the American writer Harry Matthews called 20 Lines a Day. And for him, it was sort of a writing exercise where every day before he would work on a novel he was trying to finish, he would write 20 lines in freehand, I think, on a piece of paper. And it was later published as a book. And I thought it would be fun to deliberately misinterpret that expression, lines of writing as drawn lines, and do a series of drawings of 20 lines. Now there's some conceptual artists like On Kawara, a Japanese painter who died recently, who take these kind of things very seriously conceptually. He was the guy who would draw every day. He would paint the day's date in white on a black background, and then he would package it in a box with the day's newspaper and put it away in his archive. So if I'd been that extreme, I might have actually literally drawn 20 lines every day and then stopped. But as we've seen, I like a theme and variations. So I was drawn to the idea of using this as a way to explore drawing. I also dropped the lines a day thing pretty quickly because I'm too lazy to draw every single day. So I just called it 20 lines, ended up being the name of the project. It was a really fun way for me to explore some of these more plastic aspects of drawing and thinking about form, foreground and background, layout, abstraction, and interacting a little bit more with modern art and contemporary art. Different techniques, just making marks on paper, all this stuff you do in art school, which I didn't get to do. And there's still room for representation in there. I might draw a hand or even old cartoon characters. Here's Tintin drawn in just 20 lines. So it's an extension of this idea of the variation on a theme that dates back to this book that I started working on over 20 years ago. The 20 lines, like the exercise and style, I started sharing online. They were pretty popular. I did an exhibit in Barcelona, and I'm planning to make a book collection of them at some point, although it still there's no concrete plans at this point. So it's been, oh boy, I hate to even say it, 25 years since I first read Raymond Queneau's Exercise and Style. And even though at the time it's a book that really impressed me straight away, and I knew it was something special that I was going to do something with. But really only in the last few years that I've fully come to understand just how thoroughly that book changed the course of my life. It's really something that has set me on a path that has led me to not just the Exercise and Style book, but everything that's come after it, including many of my friendships and opportunities for travel and teaching and meeting people. I'm very grateful to Raymond Queneau and for all the work that he did. So, and I'm grateful to you for coming out tonight to hear me talk about my work. And thanks to the embassy and to bringing me out to Russia for this great trip. This is my last talk and last evening of almost 10-day journey. I've been in St. Petersburg and in Kazan as well, doing some workshops, signing books, and doing talks like this. So that said, I think I still have enough energy to answer a few questions if anyone wants to ask some questions from the audience. Thank you.